Joe Castiglione from San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Joe is the Deputy Director for Technology, Data, and Analysis. Joe's been around the block a while. He was I remember Joe at RSG, Joe, were you at Sandag as well, maybe for a while?
No, although
okay.
I live down in San Diego.
Okay, so, all right. I must be thinking of somebody else.
Them.
Sure. And Joe's with SFCTA now. He's going to be talking about TNCs and their survey insights from California. And secretly, I hope he shows us some of the cool visualizations of TNC metrics. They're almost real time. I was kind of poking around on the SFCTA website, looking at pickup and drop offs by time of day in different parts of the city. Really cool website. But if not, I'm sure Joe can send you a link to that website, and it's really, really interesting information and visualization, I should say. But with that, Joe, take it away.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I'm not going to actually show you any visualizations today, but I would certainly encourage you to go to our website, where we do have a bunch of information that is interactive visualizations, not only of TNC data, including something, stuff that I don't think a lot of people have seen before, like what TNCs do when they're not in service. But also not quite real-time performance monitoring and all that sort of stuff. I will say, on a related note, though, for any who are particularly interested, my talk today is about some travel diary surveying that we've done. We actually have a visualization platform that was developed to help visualize travel diary survey, which has really proved to be super critical in our own QA/QC of the data. It's all open source. You can get it off our GitHub site. It takes about 1 to 2 hours to get it all set up. So it's really straightforward. So that is a visualization piece that's related to what I'm going to talk about now. But let me just bring up my screen and go into full screen mode. Can you all see this?
Looks good.
All right, cool. So I want to talk to you about, I call it recent California Travel Diary survey findings. And it's actually from a bunch of surveys. So back in late 2018, early 2019, we did a bunch of travel diary surveying. The first round of it was very much focused just on the Bay Area. However, we then did a second round just a few months later that gathered information from 3 California regions, not only the San Francisco Bay Area, but also portions of LA and Orange County, almost all of Orange County, but mostly kind of west side focused of LA, because LA is insanely huge, and then also San Diego County. I want to upfront, this is kind of branded as a SFCTA presentation, because that's the template I had. But in fact, there were a lot of parties that were involved in this. First and foremost, our collaboration with folks at MTC. They were partners with whom we worked really closely throughout all of this. The second is Caltrans. It was through an SB1 grant that funded the data collection in the other 2 regions, as well as augmented the Bay Area travel data collection. Our partners, peer agencies down at Sandag and SCAG, and then finally RSG, whose app, Our Moves, we deployed for this. I want to talk very briefly about the nature of the surveys themselves. They're a little bit different than some of the surveys folks may have done in the past. Number one, it was 100% app-based. So all the surveying was done using RSG's Our Moves app. With respect to the kind of recruitment, it was 100% random address-based recruitment. We did do oversampling in order to try and pull in more TNC trips. And for the most part, that was successful. But it was random address based, which allowed us to not have to invent new methods for kind of non-random address based expansion, which is super key. It was person based rather than trying to collect data from everybody in a household. And this was primarily for 2 reasons, really. One, it's more cost effective to try and get this data. Two, that most of the TNC users, not all, tend to be adults. And three, and they were really kind of what we were hoping to capture an oversample of. And three is that most of our models, with the very few exceptions, are largely, kind of adult person-based models. There are, some household-based models that we develop, maybe a vehicle availability model at a household level. And certainly there are some children models, school activity generation or destination choice or mode choice. But the vast majority of the trips that we are capturing in our models are made by adults. It was a whole week worth of data, 7 days of data collection. A lot of people are concerned that you're not going to get, there's going to be attrition through that. We actually got on average something like 6.5 days of data from every participant. So, we didn't get a lot of attrition. Just to note, I mentioned this before, it's 100% pre-pandemic. So we're not seeing any kind of COVID effects in any of this. And then finally, I mentioned this, the recruitment being random address based. We did develop multiple weights to kind of account for this. So for example, smartphone penetration in the Bay Area is super high, as you can probably imagine, well over 90%, 95% or something like that. However, it does vary. So for example, old folks, maybe not unsurprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, have lower rates of smartphone ownership. So we wanted to be able to control for both smartphone owning adults and all adults. That was basically, we were able to do that using kind of complementary data sets, primarily NHTS. There were individual weights developed for all days of the week. So we could look at things by day of week, as well as a set of typical weekdays. So all in all, there was a whole set of kind of weighting and expansion, lots of lessons to be learned from that. I'm going to talk first about the Bay Area data that we did, Bay Area data collection, and then talk about the 3 zones. And the reason why I have this slide up, I'm sure you've seen stuff like, summaries like this before, but it's really to talk about some of the challenges. Now, we very much had a few use cases for this data, or these data. One, of course, was for model development, which I alluded to a moment ago, but certainly we wanted to be able to say something about travel in the region writ large. It had been 10 years or so since a household travel or travel diary survey had been done. But we wanted to be able to contextualize TNCs kind of within that as well. But the data does require a lot of cleaning. As I'm sure everybody on this call probably knows, what you see in these 2 tables is kind of a summary of the raw data that we got from RSG for all trips, all days of week, and then just our focus down to the weekday. And again, this is just the Bay Area data set. This is not the 3 statewide areas. And you actually do lose a lot of trips. So we started, for example, with about 175,000 trips raw delivered to us. That would include kind of unlinked trips, extraneous trips, et cetera. By the time we're actually getting down to building tours for use in modeling, right? So where we have all of the information, all of the trips on the tours, all of the tours for a person on a given person day, we lose about, more than 30% of the trips. It was about 121,000 trips. Not a small number, but you just have to be kind of clear about that. When we looked at the weekday, it was a little bit better. We started with about 84,000 trips and it dropped to about 70,000 trips. In total, it was about 28,000, 29,000 person days in the whole data set and about 16,000 person days in the weekday data set. I want to put this up here just a little bit to give you some kind of context, because as I said before, one of our main interests was in looking at kind of mode shares or looking at, kind of contextualizing TNCs within the San Francisco region. And what you see here, we've segmented this by, this might not be of interest to everybody, but just to, one of our key interests, we're a San Francisco agency, but we nest within the, we live within the whole Bay Area, which is a huge region, as everybody knows. But we often look at just like, hey, what's happening in San Francisco? What's happening in the trips that are coming to or from San Francisco? And what's happening in the rest of the region? And you can see some, pretty striking differences, some things that jump out immediately. For example, our TNCs represent in this survey about a few years ago about 3.5% of all within SF trips. That was about 6 times the level of TNC trip making outside of San Francisco. Walk trips, we've got a much higher kind of walk transit share within San Francisco. Pretty high walk transit share, very high walk transit share for those trips coming back and forth to San Francisco, and much higher shares than walk transit in the rest of the region. And interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly, walk trips comprise a massive amount of the trip making that's happening in San Francisco, almost 45%, as opposed to about 11% in the rest of the region. We included, of course, we were really interested in some of the new mobility modes. They got a lot of buzz, at least at the time of this data collection, which again was like basically from late 2018, fall of 2018, spring of 2019. Car share almost didn't show up at all. Bike share shows up a little bit. Scooter share, very, very small. So at least as of, 3 years ago, we were seeing very little penetration in aggregate for these modes. One thing that we're also interested too is trip lengths, right? And what we see here is that within San Francisco, not surprisingly, many of our trips are really short, 2 to 3 miles for the most part, with the exception of, I think, walk trips are a bit shorter. Trips outside the region are longer, about 6.2 miles on average, versus 1.7 on average in the city. But where the really long trips are to and from San Francisco, which is not entirely surprising given its location and historical or historic location as the center of much of the employment in the region. So now I'll dive into some of the TNC findings that we found, that we had specifically. One of the things that we're really interested in was in looking at TNC usage by different ages. And so what you see here is a chart of what we classify people as either not using TNC. So over the week of data, did they ever use it? Was their average use of a TNC on a typical weekday 0? And that was the vast majority of people. Or was it low? Was it between, on a typical weekday, they made between 0 and 1 TNC trips? Or was it high? Like on average, on a typical weekday, they made more than 1 trip. So what we see here is, and this is categorized by non-SF and SF trip making, and this is by age. So maybe not surprisingly, the lowest, the youngest folks have the highest penetration of kind of regular users, either low or high, greater than 0. And that was true both in outside of San Francisco and within San Francisco, which is shown on the right. What's shown on the right, though, is also that TNC usage is simply a lot greater. There are some what we'll call regular, like on average, they need something more than 0 TNC trips across, all ages, and including 10% of folks who are 75 or older, who, in fact, 65%, 65 or older, who are at least making some TNC trips. That pattern was not actually seen, or a kind of a somewhat different story is told when you look at TNC usage by income. So outside of San Francisco, you can see, which is on the left, you can see that the green and red, which is some regular TNC usage, is actually highest. It's not super high, but it's highest in the lowest income groups and in the highest income groups. And in the middle, between say 50 and 200K, is actually where the lowest usage of TNCs is, which is an interesting finding. What we see on the right is the San Francisco, and it's a little bit of a different story, where pretty clearly, as income increases, regular TNC usage increases. So again, this is we see different patterns in a highly urbanized environment like San Francisco. We definitely see more usage of TNCs as income grows up. In more suburban areas, what we see is the higher and the lowest income strata are most likely to use TNCs. In the middle are most likely to drive around. Another thing that we were super interested in is the question of mode shift. There's been a tremendous amount of rhetoric around how TNCs, or now in San Francisco, autonomous vehicles providing publicly available shared rides will be able to solve congestion problems. And, that may be true, but as a number of researchers have demonstrated, even kind of hypothetically, it only pencils out if there's very high occupancies of these vehicles. And that's really because if you happen to be in a car and you switch to a TNC, you're actually probably producing more vehicle miles of travel, because there's the trip itself transporting you, but then there's the deadheading miles, which typically represent somewhere between 25 to 50% of all the miles that these vehicles travel. And of course, you're definitely adding vehicle miles of travel if you were taking transit or biking or walking. And what we found in San Francisco is something like 45% of trips were either, more than 45% of trips were either, that were taking TNCs, were either shifting from transit, which is about 28%, walking or biking, which was about 10%, or just making a new trip, 8.7%, just induced travel. And these trip lengths, at least within San Francisco, of course, the trips in general are much shorter there, are all pretty much about the same, 2 to 3 miles in length. So again, there's a significant concern that if we're, the TNC trips are really pulling folks away from what we would call more sustainable modes or inducing travel, that their negative impacts may very well exceed any positive impacts with respect to congestion. I want to shift over to the 3-region comparison. So again, the same methodology, the same app, for the most part, all of the same recruitment strategies, but as I'll describe a little bit later, there was one nuance with respect to how Sandag did their surveying that actually did make a difference. And you'll see the results of that, which I think speak to why we need to be very careful about how we do our survey data collection. What this chart shows is each color type represents a different area, a different region. The Bay Area is blue shades, San Diego is yellow shades, and LA and Orange County are green shades. And this is a little, maybe not entirely surprising chart to see. The darker shades are the weekday summaries, and the lighter colors are the weekend summaries. And what this shows is a pretty consistent story across all of the regions, which is that drive alone is much higher share of travel on weekdays and much lower on weekends. And I guess in a complementary way, shared rides are lower on weekdays and higher on weekends. You can also see something about the overall kind of mode shares across the different regions, with San Diego and LA obviously having higher drive mode shares than the Bay Area, and the Bay Area generally having higher walk and transit mode shares. You can see in all of this that TNCs are a very small share of all the trips in all of these regions. Here's something where I alluded to some of the challenges with and the need to be extremely kind of rigorous and sensitive about how recruitment is done. What we see here is a comparison of trip purposes on the right, on the left. These are all trips, not just TNC trips specifically. And actually, there's a fair amount of consistency across all of the regions in terms of the share of overall travel. The only things that kind of pop out a little bit is that there's a little bit less escorting down in the San Diego region, a little bit more social recreational trips in the San Diego region. Otherwise, they're broadly consistent with each other. What we see on the right is a kind of a zoom in just on the TNC trips. And so there's a couple of ways that you can look at that. One is that, you can see that there are certain purposes that are simply really not used very often. I shouldn't say not used, but not used as often, which are things like TNCs are not used as often for things like escorting or shopping. For the Bay Area and LA regions, we actually do see some fairly kind of consistent, fairly reasonable consistency across those regions. But as you can see, the yellow bars for Sandag really pop out a lot. And you can see that I note this in the kind of weighted, and I'll elaborate this on just a moment, where for some reason, we have these very high levels of, in the expanded survey, meals using TNCs or social recreational using TNCs, and very little personal business trips in the San Diego using TNCs in a way that kind of is jarring compared to the other two regions. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. One of our interests too was in, how different groups might be using TNCs. And so what this chart shows you, again, with the color scheme that indicates the region, the darker color represents the share of all trips made by this particular group. And the lighter color represents the share of all TNC trips made by this particular group. So for example, for the Hispanic population, which is shown on the far left. We can see in the Bay Area, they're about 22%. Hispanic folks makes up about 22% of all the trips and take about 20% of all of the TNC trips, about even. In the case of San Diego, Hispanic folks represent about 35% of the population, but only make about 20% of the TNC trips. So they're actually making fewer TNC trip making relative to their overall trip making. And there's a different story in LA. So each region has its own story, particularly with respect to the Hispanic population, which is in LA and Orange County, in these sampled regions, about 40% of the population is Hispanic, but they make almost 55% of all of the TNC trips. And you can see different, kind of patterns emerging in each one of these different areas, and with each one of these different groups. We also looked at this by income. And, you saw some of the income charts that I showed you just within San Francisco. Now we're looking at across all of the regions. And we do see some kind of similar patterns that we saw in the kind of the All Bay area, which is at the lowest level of the income spectrum. And the folks with the least money, they actually, they represent, so for example, in 25K, in all three regions, for example, in San Diego, about 9% of the trips are made by low-income folks, but almost 20% of the TNC trips. Similarly, in LA, about maybe say 13% of all of the trips are made by low-income folks, but almost 25% of all of the TNC trips are. The story gets a little bit cloudier as we get to the higher income brackets, where in the Bay Area and in LA we see that the most wealthy in that 250K plus, a lot more trip making, relatively speaking, made by TNCs, made in TNCs by high income folks, and that's true in LA and in the Bay Area. But there seems to be a little bit of a different pattern that's happening in the San Diego region. So a little bit of an unclear story. We also wanted to look at what people's reported TNC wait times were, and when we looked at this was by income, and we compared the wait times that different income groups experience for their TNC trips relative to the kind of regional average wait times. And what we found actually was that, again, a little bit of a mixed story, but if you blur your eyes, you can kind of see that it appears that as you go up in income, you are likely to have lower wait times than the population kind of overall. So that suggests there may be some equity questions about whether higher income areas are perhaps being better served. Again, a little bit of a kind of a dog bites man story here across all of the regions. You can clearly see younger people, which typically, like for example, in that lowest income bracket, represent less than 10% of all trip making are made by folks 18 to 24, but 24 to 27% of all TNC trips are made by this group. And that effect kind of diminishes as you get older, so that by the time you get to the highest income brackets, there's 2 or 3 or 5 times as many of all trips being made, or maybe 1/5 as many of the trips are being made by TNC trips are being made by older folks relative to the trip making overall. Here's where I want to talk a little bit more about why kind of sampling and expansion is really key. There's a lot of information on this, so I'll try and kind of lay it out clearly. If you look at the charts on the left-hand side, we were particularly interested in, as I said before, to the extent that shared vehicles can help address questions such as, urban congestion, it really is dependent on there being relatively high occupancy levels of those vehicles. And so what we compare here is in the upper right, these are non-pooled trips. So somebody has not requested a pooled trip. That's the distinction is here is, you can hail an Uber or a Lyft, and you can hail it as a pooled, meaning you're going to share it with somebody who's not in your household or social party. So it's just your group, or pooled, where you're sharing either your trip or your individual trip or your group's trip with another. So this is just based on not whether there's the occupancy, but whether the product was a pooled product. And so in the upper right, you can see something that kind of makes sense, right? For non-pooled trips, I didn't want to pool this trip. In the Bay Area, which is blue again, and LA, which is green again, The vast majority of those trips, non-pool trips, just have one passenger in them. And then as the occupancy goes down, or excuse me, as the occupancy increases, the share goes down. So very few non-pool trips have 3 or 4 people in it. There's a little bit of a weird spike in in LA with the 5+, but otherwise it's a pretty clear pattern. What was a little bit weird though was there was this stuff with San Diego where in the weighted data, non-pool trips had a very different pattern where
Hello, everybody,
actually,
and welcome.
okay, hello.
Wait a couple of minutes as everyone joins.
My apologies. I'll find that and I'll shut him
Okay.
off.
Was San Diego data was a bit weirder where the non-pool trips, actually almost half of them had 2 people, which was completely different than the other 2 regions. Similarly, when you look at the lower left, you get a pattern that kind of makes sense for the Bay Area and LA, the blue and green lines. If you're pooling a trip, they tend to have actually higher occupancies in the end. And these are vehicle occupancy. So it's what did the person request, and then ultimately what was the vehicle occupancy. But again, San Diego has this very contrary pattern, which was that pool trips actually had the lowest occupancy. So we had to do a lot of digging into this. And one of the things that we looked at was when you look at it in an unweighted way. And when you look at the unweighted data, certainly with respect to the non-pool trips, which are the vast majority of the TNC trips that we captured, the patterns look really similar. There's some strain, in the unweighted data for the pool trips, the Bay Area really kind of stands out, but San Diego and LA track really closely. And as it turns out, this had to do with how both the sampling was done and also with how the data was processed, which were some slides that I alluded to at the beginning. So with respect to the sampling, Sandag actually, kept collecting data. They had some trip targets, TNC trip targets, which the other regions did not have. Sampling was done the same way, but they literally had to exhaust the sample, send 100%, for example, of invites out to certain regions in order to try and certain sub areas in order to try and block groups in order to meet their target number of trips. And then additionally, even with that, their sample was sparse, and they ended up with trips that had these tremendous weights on them to the extent of like a weight of 16,000 or something. And depending on when the data processing is done, some of these trips, for example, people were taking an Uber or Lyft to the airport and then leaving the region for the rest of the sampling period. And we wouldn't typically include them in our modeling. It's certainly for our kind of typical weekday modeling. And so, you have to use a lot of caution when kind of both collecting and processing the data. And that was a key lesson that we learned, especially when doing these multiple regions that kind of brought it to light. I described to you the mode shift earlier that we observed in San Francisco, and it was pretty similar again when you look at the data for the Bay Area. The data on both the chart on the left and the table on the right is the same data, just presented graphically versus tabularly. And again, you can see the blue and green bars are almost the same across all of the regions. So again, just like in the Bay Area, in LA, if you sum those totals, something like more than 40% of all the trips are either a shift from a sustainable mode, transit, bike, or walk, or an induced trip. They wouldn't have made the trip otherwise. In San Diego, the data, again, due to the sampling that was done, tells a little bit of a different story. Much less shift away from transit, more shift actually away from biking and walking. And this is all an artifact of the way the data was collected. One of the final things that I'll say is with respect to, the promise of kind of shared mobility, there's certainly been a lot of rhetoric around first, last mile. There was an issue that was discussed just in the prior presentation. And now, so at the time that we were doing this data collection, late 2018, 2019, TNCs had been operating certainly in the Bay Area and in other regions for at least 8 years. And of course, certainly in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and LA as well, maybe less so in San Diego, there's an incredibly rich transit service. So, if there was an opportunity to really have TNCs provide first, last mile access to transit, you would think that it would probably start to show up a little bit because it would have had time to kind of mature as a market. we actually didn't really see that. What we see here, and if you look at the kind of TNCs, that table has 3 columns for transit access mode and 3 columns for transit egress mode. In the case of transit access in the Bay Area, less than 1% of the trips use TNCs to access transit. In San Diego, it was actually 0%. LA was a little bit higher, 2.7%. As an egress mode, generally across all regions, it was around 0.5%. So I think this speaks to the issue of while there may be the promise of TNCs as a first last mile option, even in mature transit-rich areas, that really hasn't happened. Now, why that hasn't happened, we can't answer that, but it certainly, as presently configured, we don't see that kind of happening kind of on the ground. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I can either maybe stop sharing, or I could leave this up if people want to reference individual slides.
Yeah, we had we had a bit of a chat going on that we've got, I don't know, 5 minutes or so to kind of review some of the questions that came up in the chat. But first off, thank you, Joe. Really, really interesting as always. Findings and presentations and charts, and super easy to understand. California is such a big market, and I think you did a great job dissecting it into regional differences and trend patterns within kind of each big metropolitan area within California, which is a difficult task. And in particular, I appreciated the equity lens around a lot of the metrics that you provided. With that, I guess one of the first comments that popped up was around the income, and I believe this was on slide 9, and you had mentioned it as well. I believe it was just in the San Francisco kind of test area where you were having low income folks outside. I believe it was non-SF area. You were having low income folks kind of as relatively high users of TNC, and that invoked some discussion amongst the attendees today about maybe some rationale as to why that was going on. And I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about that phenomenon and maybe some reasons why that may have been occurring.
I mean, we haven't done a deep dive on this particular question. I should say that there was a similar survey that was done, not as part of our effort, but a year or two earlier for SACOG, the Sacramento region. And they similarly observed this, well, if you look at it the other way, kind of a U-shaped distribution of usage with the highest and lowest income brackets using it the most. I mean, I think our hypothesis would simply be maybe that there's 2 factors at work. First and foremost, vehicle availability. That what we may be seeing is that there may be limited vehicle access within those, or ownership within some of those lower income households. So the availability of this kind of lower cost alternative, given that TNC costs were both lower, and also the increased availability. Taxi supplies have been, previously pretty heavily regulated. So now there was a larger fleet. We estimated in San Francisco it was between 10 to 15 times as large as the taxi fleet at any given hour of the day. So a combination of both increased availability, reduced costs, that it would serve this market better. But I think it's a question that certainly warrants further investigation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Elliot had chimed in, and to the point of, people just may not have another option and just need to get places urgently. That might be a market that gets used. Another question that came up and kind of came across my radar as well was the TNC wait time analysis that you did by income. Slide 15, maybe? Yeah,
yes,
there we go. And the question was, let's see, does this data account for the wait and save or priority pickup type services the TNCs currently offer. Not sure if these were implemented at the time of data collection, but that would let people more directly trade cost for wait times.
Yeah, these prices weren't, excuse me, these results were before the availability of those programs, to my knowledge. I don't think those were in I think they're relatively recent kind of innovations. So I don't think that's likely what's happening here. But again, certainly worthy of additional investigation. We did it for what it's worth. We also did collect information on fares. And so if we did want to look at something like the trade-off that people are making for, kind of average per mile distances versus wait time, et cetera, that's certainly something the data could support.
And I think you made a comment in your presentation too about, maybe some insights around equitable service and whatnot being provided. Maybe there's a disparity there. I don't know. I thought that was interesting. I could see where you were headed there.
I mean, I think we found. I was going to say, I think we found some kind of mixed findings with respect to equity, and so I think we need to be very cautious about what and how we say. So for example, when we did our TNCs Today report, which was really our kind of first insight just into like where the trips were happening, and that what we found in general, and we did compare it to taxis, was that broadly speaking, TNCs, I think by virtue of just their huge fleet size, were serving areas of the city that, quite frankly, our taxi industry, which was very much oriented around serving visitor travel, core travel, and supporting kind of disabled and paratransit access. That the TNCs definitely were serving broader areas of the city, which I think was great. We've also done some subsequent analysis and had a paper come out recently that looked at the kind of out of service behavior of TNCs. And what that suggested was that actually when we look at what, after somebody's dropped, after a ride has been dropped off, what do the TNCs do? Do they cruise around in an area? Do they park, or do they relocate? And what we found is that there was a significant but small indication that they relocate away from lower income and minority areas than into higher income and whiter areas. And again, it was a significant finding, but it was a very small effect.
Yeah, it speaks to Alex's point here that he's commenting that TNC drivers might want to position around richer areas with to provide those shorter wait times.
That's right. I mean, we also found, for example, in that study that like you wouldn't think a TNC would cruise around like a taxi. A taxi, there might be an economic incentive to cruising around because you can pick up a ride hail, on the street. With TNCs, it doesn't seems like they would just be burning gas, but a huge proportion of the miles that they travel, I think it was well over 20%, 28% or something, was just cruising around, which seems counterintuitive, economically.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate you coming, and you're welcome to stay for as long as you want for the meeting here.
Yes, I will.
Yeah,